day of Black History Month, and I wanted to come on and share my second cup of coffee with you and a few thoughts for the day and as we go into this month. As I do when I start all of my live streams, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and these are the lands that are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor and thank the Piscataway Nation. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. I want to honor them as the host peoples of these lands. And I want to just let people know how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So there's been a lot going on. And it's been a very interesting few weeks since the inauguration. President Biden has been issuing a lot of executive orders. There's been a lot of things going on, and he's actually doing what he pledged he would do throughout the campaign, which is he's returning us back to the status quo. Also, with President Trump off of Twitter, things are much quieter. There's not kind of this screaming back and forth by global leaders. And so things have been much more mundane, and it's actually created a little bit of a weird environment of knowing how do we address and how do I even continue to address things moving forward, because there's not a lot of drastic things happening on a regular basis, but there are some slower things taking place. And Joe Biden, as I said earlier, is doing what he set out, what he promised to do, which is to reestablish the status quo. And these are things we need to highlight and talk about and actually really work to be made aware of. But today is the first day of Black History Month. And I want to just start by acknowledging the very vital and important role that African Americans have played in our nation's history. I want to acknowledge that we are not a nation of immigrants, no matter what our leaders like to tell us. When we say we're a nation of immigrants, we actually leave out two very important communities. We leave out Native Americans who are indigenous to these lands, and we leave out African Americans who did not immigrate here, but rather were kidnapped and brought here and then enslaved. And so when we talk about and allow our leaders to use this mythological designation of we're a nation of immigrants, we are trying to basically block out our memory of our deep injustices that our country is founded on, which is rooted in the doctrine of discovery. And so just like I say at the start of my book, Unsettling Truths, you cannot discover land already inhabited. I need to continue to say that because we are not a nation of immigrants. We have two vital communities that never immigrated here. And we need to acknowledge their presence and their contributions and the injustices committed against them in these lands. And so I want to acknowledge my African-American brothers and sisters. I want to let them know how deeply appreciative I am for who they are, for what they bring to our country. And I'm grateful that we have this month of February to intentionally make ourselves more aware of the history of African Americans within our country. One of the quotes I speak about frequently, I've done this in the campaign, I do it in my book, I've done it in numerous places, is the need for our nation to have common memory. And I use this quote by George Erasmus, a Dene leader and elder from the Dene people in Canada. When he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions there, he said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he said, you have to start by creating common memory. You've heard me use this quote, talk about how our nation does not have a common memory. And even the fact that we have things like Black History Month and a Native American Heritage Month and things like that are evidence of the fact that we don't have a common memory. You know, that I remember growing up, right? As children, we would always say to our parents, well, how come there's a Mother's Day and there's a Father's Day and there's never a Children's Day? And the answer I always got back was, well, because every day is Children's Day, right? So we need to have a special day to honor the role of mothers and fathers. Every day, the kids get the attention and get the spotlight and get the energy. And anyway, it's almost like that with our country, right? We have to have a Native American Heritage Month. We have to have an African or a Black History Month, because the history we talk about, what we teach in our schools, the common memory that we have actually excludes these communities. And so to rectify that, we've created these months where we're going to focus on these and bring these out. And I think it's great that we have these months. I'm glad we can have these times to intentionally acknowledge these histories that are so vital to our identity as a nation. But I also think it just highlights the fact that we don't have a common memory. And so I want to encourage people this month, especially in the month of February, to use this month to educate ourselves on the history of African Americans and of Black people here in the United States. And actually to use this month to read authors, to listen to historians, to listen to music, and to understand the poetry and other things of the African American community, and allow the community to speak to us, to educate us, and to help us understand from their perspective and in their words, their own history, right? If you go to church, take these Sundays this month to listen to sermons from African American preachers. If you like listening to podcasts, take this month to listen to podcasts produced and hosted by African American people. If you like to read books written by African American authors. Allow the African American community, the Black community in our country, to speak to us throughout this month, and to be intentional about hearing the history from the perspective of their community, of that community. It's something I'm going to try to be intentional about this week. I'm going to try this month and talk about it throughout my Second Cups of Coffee, but it's something I want to encourage everybody to do throughout this month. Now, even when we look at kind of the current events going on today, right? If you are listening to the headlines coming out this morning, you will know that there was a military coup in Myanmar. And they have basically declared a year-long state of emergency, and they are shutting down the parliamentary government that was elected and claiming voter fraud. You also have been listening to probably the protests and the arrest of protesters in Russia, as they have been protesting the government and the injustices that are happening there. And what I find fascinating is that the U.S. has condemned or come out against both of those things, which they should be condemned. Those are not right, what's going on there. But even our own country, even in this past month, right, just 3.5 weeks ago, we had an insurrection and a white nationalist terrorist attack in our own nation, instigated by baseless claims from our former president that the election was stolen from him, with him encouraging his followers that morning to go down to the Capitol and to demand that things be changed. And they did, and an insurrection happened. White nationalist terrorism took place. And now our Congress doesn't even want to hold our leaders accountable to that. They don't even want to acknowledge that this is what took place and this is what happened. And so the fact that the United States of America would condemn what's going on in other nations, when we can't even hold white landowning men accountable for the white nationalist terrorism that they instigate here in this country, it's shameful. Right? This isn't even about common memory. This is about a common reality. And we can't even acknowledge what's happening in front of our eyes. And it's because of how deeply systemic white supremacy and how institutionalized racism is within our systems that we can't even hold white landowning men accountable when they instigate these incredibly unjust acts that by any other measure, and had they been perpetrated or conducted by any other person from any other race, it would have been called out as terrorism immediately and denounced in a bipartisan fashion, and there would have been a trial and there would have been demands for justice. But because of the way our nation's been set up, it's turned into a partisan shouting match. We can't even decide on what's just and who to hold accountable within our nation when it comes to the injustices and the oppression of white landowning men. And that is unfortunate. And the globe sees this, right? They have to see our lack of integrity in calling out these military coups and these military put downs in other nations when we are unwilling to even hold our own leaders accountable for those very same actions here in the United States of America. The other thing I want to bring up, and I tweeted about this last week, and I brought this up on my website, which was, it was last Tuesday, almost a week ago now, that the San Francisco School Board voted to basically remove the names of historical figures and political figures from 44 of their schools because of their support for white supremacy or racism or other things like that. And among those names they chose to remove was the name of Abraham Lincoln. And I read several articles of people accusing the San Francisco School Board of progressive overreach. And people were astounded at how could you remove the name of Abraham Lincoln from a school? How could you be so misinformed that you would actually think Abraham Lincoln had a negative impact on our nation? And again, this goes back to our nation's lack of a common memory. This goes back to the fact that the history we teach within our schools is mythological. This goes back to the fact that because we've won virtually every one of our wars, white America has been able to write their own history. And therefore, the history that we teach is mythological. It's not based in historical fact or even in reality. And so I put out a statement, and I published a statement on my website. I put it out on my Twitter feed, and I just want to read it here again today because this is important. I said, I support the San Francisco School Board's decision to remove President Abraham Lincoln's name from its schools. The hanging of the Dakota 38 in 1862, the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, and the Navajo Long Walk beginning in 1863 resulted in the deaths of thousands of Native peoples, and they all took place under the Lincoln administration. These atrocities were not random, but they occurred within 2.5 years of President Lincoln signing the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act in July of 1862. At that time, the U.S. government was aggressively ethnically cleansing lands in order to clear the way for white settlement, the Transcontinental Railway, and Manifest Destiny. On top of that, Abraham Lincoln's defining legacy, the 13th Amendment, doesn't actually abolish slavery. It states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The clause, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, results in the 13th Amendment merely redefining and codifying slavery under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And this is the same U.S. criminal justice system that today incarcerates people at the highest rate of any country in the world. We incarcerate our people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate that we incarcerate white people. The Lincoln Memorial, there hangs a plaque. It's a marble plaque with a quote by Abraham Lincoln giving his thoughts on the Union. The quote hanging there states, "I would save the Union. My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union. It is not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." The Lincoln Memorial honors President Lincoln with that specific quote, stating his belief that Black lives don't matter. I cannot speak to every name the San Francisco School Board chose to remove from their schools. And I can't comment on their methodology of how they came to that conclusion. But as far as Abraham Lincoln is concerned, he was a blatant white supremacist and one of the most genocidal presidents in the history of the United States. And he is absolutely not worthy of the honor of having schools named after him. I'm grateful that this month is Black History Month. I'm grateful that we are creating space to hear from academics and authors and poets and musicians and members of the African American community. Their voices are so incredibly vital in our nation because we do not have a common memory. The fact that we can't even call out Abraham Lincoln, a blatant white supremacist and genocidal president, for his injustices is proof we don't have a common memory, and we are in desperate need of one. So I want to encourage everybody this month, please take this month to intentionally listen to the voices from the African American community, allowing them to educate us on their history, on their stories, from their perspectives. And may it not take place only during this month, but may this be a pattern that we set to do throughout the year round. This is something we have to be intentional about. We have to make space to hear and listen to and be educated by other voices with perspectives and worldviews outside of our own. This is how we create common memory. This is how we build better community. And this is what we do to lay the foundation so that we can, for the very first time, build a nation where we the people truly means all the people. I've been reflecting about my campaign for the 2020 election. And one of the biggest disadvantages I had during that campaign was the fact that most Americans didn't know their own history. They didn't know what this nation was founded on. They've never read the Constitution. They've never looked at the Declaration of Independence. They don't know what is the basis for their land titles. They don't even know the name of the native nation that was ethnically cleansed from the land where their own house sits. So when they heard me talking about the need to create a nation, to build a nation where we the people truly means all the people, they didn't know what that meant. We have reduced racism and white supremacy in the United States to a partisan problem. We truly believe it's a partisan problem. And there's so much rhetoric right now going on, seminars and webinars and people coming forward and saying, yes, now that we have Donald Trump out of office, now we can actually begin to move forward with these things. No, white supremacy and racism is a bipartisan value. It's written into our foundations. Whether you have Donald Trump wanting to make America great again, or you have Joe Biden wanting to restore the soul of America, they are both based on this myth known as American exceptionalism. And that myth is rooted in the lie of white supremacy. And that lie is based on the heresy that the United States of America has a land covenant with the God of Abraham, and therefore has the right, the obligation even, to commit genocide. These are bipartisan values. And just replacing one explicit leader who believes in the myth of American exceptionalism with another more implicit leader who absolutely believes in the myth of American exceptionalism is not going to fix or solve our problems. And so we need to continue to address these things. We need to continue to talk about these things. And this is what I want to do with my second cups of coffee. These are the things I want to talk about as we go into this next year. But we need to make some deep and foundational level changes in our country. And I think opportunities like Black History Month, which we're starting today, are wonderful ways that we can begin to do that. So, ahiat to my African American brothers and sisters. Thank you for your stories. Thank you for your voices. I want to commit to hearing your voices and listening to your voices throughout this month and setting a pattern for moving forward beyond that. I welcome your voices in helping our nation create a common memory. Ahiat, my relatives, walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakonet.